April 1945. A cold wind moves through the ruins of a barracks outside the collapsing German town of Neuengamme, lifting dust from floors that have not seen peace in years. The war is ending, but its final days feel strangely suspended, a silence threaded with distant artillery and the sharpening edge of surrender. Along a narrow gravel yard, a group of German women stand in uneven rows. Some wear worn auxiliary uniforms. Others are civilians caught in the retreat, pulled into captivity by circumstance more than command. Their faces are drawn from hunger and sleepless nights. Their hands tremble from exhaustion and uncertainty. British military medics move cautiously among them, notebooks in hand, masks tied tight. The air hangs with the acrid smell of disinfectant, the same solution sprayed through nearby huts to fight the outbreaks that have followed the chaos of liberation. Then the unexpected order cuts through the yard. "Show us your feet." The women look at one another, confused. Boots scrape the ground. A few hesitate, unsure whether this is humiliation, punishment, or some new Allied procedure none of them has heard of. They do not yet know what the medics are searching for, or why this strange request will mark the beginning of an uncomfortable, necessary inspection. And to understand how it came to this moment, we must first return to the collapsing landscape that created it. By the spring of 1945, northern Germany had become a patchwork of advancing Allied units, displaced civilians, collapsing military commands, and disease-ridden camps. The Third Reich was disintegrating faster than its officers could issue orders. Every road leading toward Hamburg, Lübeck, and Bremen was clogged with columns of fleeing soldiers, forced laborers, and families carrying everything they owned in sacks or handcarts. In this chaos, order vanished long before surrender did. British forces of the 21st Army Group pressed northward, pushing through pockets of resistance that were more frantic than coordinated. Their advance liberated territories where the infrastructure had collapsed, water systems broken, hospitals overrun, and entire villages stricken by typhus, dysentery, and lice-borne fevers that had spread unchecked during the final months of the war. Armies expect wounds. They prepare for artillery trauma, bullet injuries, and shrapnel. What they encountered in northern Germany, however, was something different. The consequences of a population moving without food, medicine, or sanitation under the pressure of total military collapse. Among those caught in the tide were thousands of German women. Some were auxiliaries from the Luftwaffe, signals units, or local defense formations. Many more were civilians from towns overrun in the final advance. Others had been assigned to administrative work in camps or military depots, now swept into captivity as the facilities fell into Allied hands. Their experiences varied widely, but the condition of their bodies told a consistent story: long marches, inadequate clothing, and weeks of poor hygiene. In many locations, especially near evacuated camps, lice were rampant. The British Medical Corps had already seen what unchecked lice infestations could cause. Only weeks earlier, units entering Bergen-Belsen confronted one of the greatest public health disasters of the war, thousands weakened by starvation and ravaged by diseases spread by lice and overcrowded barracks. That catastrophe forced the Allies to implement strict, sometimes severe medical protocols in every newly secured area, even when dealing with captured enemy personnel. No exceptions could be allowed. The disease did not distinguish between victim, guard, prisoner, or liberator. So when German women were taken into custody near Neuengamme and other northern districts, they entered a system shaped by urgency rather than routine. The Geneva Convention outlined rules for treatment, but emergency health measures operated in their own sphere. Every liberated zone followed the same immediate checklist. Separate groups: identify the sick, remove contaminated clothing, delouse, disinfect shelters, and examine extremities for signs of infection, trench foot, or lice nests hidden in seams. Feet especially. British medical officers had learned that lice often settled in the folds of socks or the lining of boots, where warmth and darkness allowed colonies to grow. Many prisoners, whether Allied, German, or displaced civilians, had marched for days in the same footwear. Some women's feet were cracked, swollen, or bleeding. Others showed signs of frostbite from the winter push or infections from untreated blisters. If one individual carried lice or disease organisms into a makeshift holding area, the entire camp could be compromised. Still, none of that context was known to the women standing in the yard. To them, the war's end had arrived as a blur of conflicting emotions: relief at surviving, fear of retaliation, shame at captivity, and the disorienting transition from authority to powerlessness. Every order from the British soldiers came filtered through exhaustion and uncertainty. They knew nothing of the protocols the Allies had constructed over weeks of clearing devastated regions. Thus, when the medics approached with notebooks and delousing kits, the atmosphere grew tense. Some of the women believed they were about to be strip-searched. Others thought they were being singled out for punishment or humiliation. A few worried that the removal of boots signaled confiscation of personal belongings, one more loss in a chain of losses stretching back through the war. The soldiers giving the instructions, however, were not interrogators. They were not conducting discipline or enforcing authority. Their job that morning was simple: prevent another medical crisis in an army already overburdened by one. The women could not know it, but what seemed like an odd, even demeaning command was rooted in a desperate need to contain diseases that had already killed tens of thousands in the region. And as the confusion spread through the ranks of prisoners, the delicate balance between human dignity and public health, a balance often strained in wartime, would become increasingly visible. That tension becomes clearer when we explore the deeper circumstances shaping these medical decisions. The British forces entering northern Germany in April 1945 faced a landscape where the boundaries between civilian, prisoner, and combatant had blurred almost completely. Many of the women gathered in makeshift holding sites were not soldiers in the conventional sense. Some had served as typists, clerks, or radio assistants in small Wehrmacht detachments. Others had worked in supply depots that collapsed as Allied units advanced. A number had been forcibly conscripted into camp labor or auxiliary service during the final year of the war, a period when Germany increasingly depended on women to sustain systems rapidly breaking apart. When these women were taken into custody, Allied units followed a standardized progression designed in response to earlier liberation crises. First came separation by gender, then by health condition, then by affiliation, civilian, auxiliary, or camp staff. Yet even those categories were unstable. Many German women had discarded their uniforms during the retreat, fearing retribution. Others wore civilian coats over military skirts. Identification papers were often missing or destroyed. In this confusion, medical teams had to treat everyone as a potential health risk until proven otherwise. This was not bureaucratic rigidity, it was survival logic. Weeks earlier, at Belsen, British medics encountered bodies weakened beyond recognition. They witnessed how lice had spread typhus with lethal efficiency, moving through overcrowded barracks in days. Reports sent up the chain of command emphasized a single truth: any newly secured area could become another outbreak zone if preventative steps were delayed. That warning guided every procedure that followed. Thus, the order to examine feet was not a minor detail, but a direct response to the patterns of disease transmission the Allies had documented. Lice frequently nested along seams of socks or inside boot linings. Soldiers learned that even a seemingly clean individual might carry an infestation capable of igniting a wider crisis. To prevent that, every person entering a holding site had to undergo inspection, whether they were German soldiers, civilian refugees, or women captured in work detachments near former camps. For many of the women, however, the medical logic behind these checks remained invisible. They experienced the process through the lens of dislocation and fear. Public health measures, even when carefully explained, often felt like violations of dignity. Removing boots in front of strangers, especially soldiers of the occupying force, provoked shame and confusion. Some women had wrapped rags around infected feet. Others used makeshift bandages for blisters acquired during long evacuations. The idea of revealing these wounds, physical markers of the war's humiliations, intensified their anxiety. Sensing this discomfort, British medical officers attempted to balance necessity with respect. Diaries from personnel in the area describe physicians speaking softly, offering brief explanations, and working quickly to reduce embarrassment. But they also acknowledged the limits of compassion in chaotic conditions. When hundreds needed to be processed before the next column of displaced people arrived, there was little room for ceremony. The procedures had to be efficient, even if they felt abrupt to those subjected to them. Parallel institutions supported these efforts. UNRA teams, already working alongside the British, reinforced medical screenings and supplied disinfectants and fresh linens. The Red Cross provided documentation assistance, helping identify civilians separated from families. Local German medical staff, where available, were briefly conscripted to help examine the most severe cases. Even so, the workload exceeded what any organization could comfortably manage. In this environment, the feet inspections, strange, unsettling, and unexpected, became a symbolic moment. They embodied a wider truth about liberation, that freedom did not arrive gently. It came with procedures, disinfectant sprays, and unfamiliar commands shouted in foreign languages. It came with the urgency of preventing one tragedy from cascading into another. Liberation demanded both compassion and hard decisions, and the women standing in the yard were witnessing the collision of those forces. Behind the scenes, officers documented everything. They filed medical notes, tallied cases of infection, and recorded the physical condition of those brought into custody. These records helped determine who needed immediate treatment, who could be transferred to a temporary holding center, and who might require further interrogation concerning their wartime roles. Many of the women would not realize that their fate, whether they were treated as civilians or detained as POWs, could hinge on these early observations. What seemed like a simple order, "show us your feet," was in fact a diagnostic threshold. Once they complied, the next steps would unfold: treatment, classification, and the sometimes uncomfortable intersection of medical necessity and military control. From these conditions, several distinct angles emerge, each revealing a different layer of the moment's complexity. Human confusion, fear, and dignity. For the women subjected to the order, the command to show your feet was startling in its absurdity. Many had endured months of deprivation, long marches, air raids, and the constant fear of being caught in collapsing front lines. To stand, boots removed, before uniformed soldiers from an enemy army, strangers who spoke a foreign language, was disorienting. Confusion quickly gave way to a mixture of fear and shame. Eyewitness testimonies recorded in the Imperial War Museum archives describe women hesitating, glancing at one another for guidance, some pressing palms to their faces or shifting from foot to conceal sores, blisters, or frostbite. Their reactions were not of defiance, but of instinctive vulnerability. In that moment, centuries of social conditioning, modesty, and trauma collided with the pragmatic urgency of wartime public health. Yet these human reactions also reveal resilience. Despite humiliation, women complied, showing remarkable composure under scrutiny. Their internal struggle, balancing instinctive self-preservation with the need to obey, highlights the often overlooked psychological weight of captivity and liberation. Beneath the medical and tactical reasoning, there was a profoundly human story of embarrassment, fear, and adaptation. Medical/technological, disease, lice, and the science behind inspection. The Allied insistence on inspecting feet was rooted in stark scientific necessity. Lice infestations, particularly those carrying typhus, posed a lethal threat. British medical officers knew from prior liberation campaigns that lice could transmit disease rapidly, especially in overcrowded or unsanitary environments. Boots, socks, and the folds of toes were prime hiding spots for lice colonies. Delousing was no simple procedure. Officers carried disinfectant sprays, brushes, and specialized combs. Feet were examined for open wounds, signs of infection, fungal disease, or frostbite, each a potential vector for broader epidemics. In some cases, boots were soaked in chemical solutions before being returned. Medical officers' notes indicate that skipping this step could result in outbreaks capable of overwhelming the temporary hospitals being set up behind the lines. What seems bizarre from the human perspective was in fact a preventive technology of its time. The methods, while blunt, were grounded in empirical observation. The Allies had refined them after years of confronting typhus outbreaks among both civilian and military populations in war-torn Europe. Every foot inspected, every sock removed, was a small act of containment against an invisible enemy far deadlier than any soldier's rifle. Tactical/operational, controlling risk in the chaos of liberation. From a military perspective, the inspection of feet was a tactical decision. The British forces advancing into northern Germany had to secure territory while managing large numbers of prisoners and civilians. Disease outbreaks among POWs or liberated civilians could compromise troop readiness, slow logistical operations, and create moral dilemmas if epidemics spiraled beyond control. Commanders quickly realized that the practicalities of liberation extended beyond bullets and artillery. Medical inspections, sometimes humiliating, became standard operating procedures. Every delay, every ignored protocol carried the risk of a secondary crisis, a lesson learned painfully at Bergen-Belsen. Operational reports emphasized that preventive health measures were considered as critical as securing strategic points, maintaining communication lines, or clearing minefields. Thus, an odd order, show your feet, was tactical discipline in miniature. By standardizing inspections, medical officers could categorize prisoners, isolate disease carriers, and maintain the forward momentum of advancing units. While it might appear bureaucratic or petty, the command reflected a sophisticated understanding of the operational environment, one in which victory was inseparable from the survival of both soldier and civilian populations alike. These three perspectives, human, medical, and tactical, illuminate different dimensions of the same moment. But there were still other angles to consider: leadership decisions, enemy classification, and moral or ethical dimensions of wartime procedure. Leadership/command, orders, responsibility, and oversight. The seemingly trivial instruction to inspect the women's feet actually reflected layers of leadership decisions. British officers in the field had to balance urgency, protocol, and the human factor. Field manuals provided guidance on processing prisoners, but the reality on the ground required rapid adaptation. Commanders were responsible not only for the health of their troops, but for the lives of the women and civilians in their custody. Reports from officers on site indicate that instructions were clear. Medics were empowered to remove footwear, examine extremities, and report any infections immediately. Commanders oversaw compliance, monitored efficiency, and ensured that no outbreak could halt the advance of units already stretched thin. Mistakes could result in not only disease, but disciplinary or political repercussions. The authority behind a simple order like "show your feet" was therefore profound, binding both medical logic and military necessity into one enforceable directive. Enemy/legal, POW classification, and the Geneva Convention. The women subjected to inspection occupied a legally ambiguous space. Were they civilians, auxiliary personnel, members of military formations? The Geneva Convention of 1929 specified rights and treatment for prisoners of war, but these provisions did not cover every auxiliary or forced labor participant. Medical examinations, while seemingly intrusive, were justified under international law as a necessary preventive measure. Legal advisors embedded with the British Army reviewed cases and categorized individuals accordingly. Women who had served in support roles, even non-combatant, were often classified as POWs, making inspection mandatory. Civilians were treated with discretion, but in areas where epidemic risk was high, public health needs sometimes outweighed personal privacy. The ambiguous status of these women created both procedural and moral complexity. Orders had to be enforceable, defensible, and ethically grounded, even under extraordinary circumstances. Moral/ethical, humiliation versus necessity. Perhaps the most subtle angle is ethical. From the women's perspective, removing boots and exposing injuries or sores could feel like humiliation. For the Allied medical officers, however, the act was purely preventative. Here was a collision of dignity and necessity. Safeguarding public health meant overriding social comfort. Diaries from medics and officers reveal self-consciousness about the procedure. Some tried to explain the rationale, others moved swiftly to reduce embarrassment. This tension highlights a recurring theme in wartime liberation. Human dignity and survival do not always align. The order, trivial on its face, becomes emblematic of larger ethical dilemmas. It forced both captors and captured to negotiate the boundaries of authority, compassion, and necessity in the fleeting moments between combat and peace. Taken together, these angles, human, medical, tactical, leadership, legal, and ethical, create a multidimensional understanding of what initially seems like a small, confusing order. The next stage is the decisive moment when these tensions converge. The actual inspection, the immediate reactions, and the first concrete outcomes. April 20th, 1945. The morning sun is pale over the gravel yard outside a makeshift holding area near Lübeck. A line of British medics moves through the assembled group of German women, boots in hand, disinfectant spray glinting in the weak light. The air is crisp, tinged with the smell of antiseptic and damp earth. Birds circle overhead, indifferent to the human drama unfolding below. The order echoes across the yard, "Show us your feet." A murmur ripples through the line. Women shift nervously, hands clutching coats or skirts. Some glance at each other, silent questioning in their eyes. Their boots, worn thin from weeks of retreating marches, are removed slowly. A few feet reveal open blisters, frostbite, or blackened toenails from trench conditions and forced labor. The medics crouch, examining each foot, noting signs of lice infestation, fungal infection, or gangrene. This moment is not theatrical. It is tense, procedural, and immediate. British medics are methodical, using combs and brushes, disinfecting sprays and checklists. Every second matters. Each case must be documented before the next group arrives. Soldiers stand nearby, rifles slung, maintaining order, but watching with professional detachment. Some women flinch when toes are probed, tears running down cheeks. Others remain stoic, hiding injuries as best they can. One young woman hesitates entirely, staring at the medic as if the act itself might summon punishment. A sergeant steps forward, calm but firm, reiterating the order. Compliance is not optional. The inspection reveals a spectrum of suffering. Feet show signs of malnutrition, poor circulation, frostbite, and untreated injuries. Medics quickly classify those requiring immediate attention. Bandages are applied, antifungal ointments distributed, and footwear treated or replaced. Eyewitness reports note one particular instance. A woman with severe foot infections was immediately isolated and placed under observation to prevent cross-contamination. Her peers watched silently, understanding in the absence of explanation that illness could spread silently and lethally. The command, strange and startling as it first appeared, becomes a necessary procedure for both survival and order. At the same time, the women's confusion mirrors a broader tension. Liberation is not instantaneous freedom. It is an imposition of new authority, procedures, and controls. In that yard, the simple act of revealing feet becomes a crucible, merging medical necessity, military discipline, and human vulnerability into a single, intense moment. Behind the scenes, British officers document every observation. Notes are made of lice infestations, bandaging needs, and compliance levels. These records will determine the women's classification, civilian, auxiliary, or POW, and shape the subsequent allocation of care, housing, and eventual release. The sun climbs higher, shadows shortening, as the inspections proceed. Some women are moved aside for further treatment. Others are allowed to rest, boots cleaned or replaced. For the British officers, efficiency is paramount. Every delayed minute increases the risk of disease spreading to the next group of captives or even to the soldiers themselves. By mid-morning, the order has been carried out across the yard. Initial tension gives way to a tentative rhythm. The women, still bewildered, begin to understand the logic behind the procedure, if not its execution, then at least its necessity. The strange command, once shocking, is now integrated into the process of survival. Yet this is only the first phase. What follows is a cascade of consequences: further medical intervention, logistical coordination, and the eventual moral reckoning of those involved. The turning point lies not just in compliance, but in the realization that these small, uncomfortable actions are part of a system designed to save lives amid chaos. By midday, the inspections have uncovered a range of conditions that demand urgent intervention. Medics identify severe frostbite in several women who had been forced to march barefoot through cold, wet terrain in the final retreats of the Wehrmacht. Open sores, untreated blisters, and fungal infections are catalogued and treated immediately. Temporary bandaging stations are established, and disinfectant baths are prepared for the most heavily infested footwear. One particularly harrowing case involves a young woman whose feet are blackened and swollen, evidence of prolonged neglect and exposure. She is isolated and receives priority treatment, a move that simultaneously safeguards her peers from potential lice-borne diseases. The efficiency and rigor of the procedure are essential. Every delay could result in outbreaks that would overwhelm the already stretched medical teams. The medics' methods, though sometimes perceived as harsh by the women, are deeply informed by prior crises. Lessons learned at Bergen-Belsen and other liberated sites guide every action. Officers instruct soldiers to maintain order, but medics are given broad discretion to ensure compliance with health protocols. Notes from the field emphasize that the removal of footwear is not punishment, but a diagnostic tool, essential to prevent the spread of typhus and other infectious diseases. The women, initially perplexed and embarrassed, begin to adapt to the rhythm of the inspection. Some whisper to one another, exchanging observations about the procedure. Others focus on following instructions, suppressing shame to avoid slowing the process. Their reactions, while varied, collectively reveal the psychological weight of captivity, compounded by the physical suffering of prolonged neglect and wartime hardship. In parallel, logistical operations unfold. Those classified as high risk for infection are transporting to temporary medical facilities, while the remainder are organized into holding areas for further processing. Officers cross-reference medical reports with lists of known auxiliary personnel, civilians, and camp workers, ensuring that each individual receives appropriate treatment and classification. The seemingly minor act of showing one's feet becomes a pivot for administrative and operational decisions that will shape the women's immediate futures. By late afternoon, the first wave of inspections concludes. The medics have treated dozens of women, documented scores of cases, and reinforced the critical lesson learned from previous campaigns. Prevention is as vital as cure. For the British officers, the successful execution of the inspection signifies not only a containment of disease, but the affirmation of operational control in an unpredictable environment. For the women, the experience leaves an indelible mark. What began as an odd, humiliating order becomes, in retrospect, a life-saving measure. The act of compliance bridges the gap between fear and understanding, and the yard transforms from a site of confusion into a controlled environment where health, survival, and order are momentarily aligned. Yet the consequences of these inspections extend beyond the immediate. Treatment, classification, and the psychological impact of this strange, invasive procedure ripple through the group. Morale, perceptions of authority, and the balance between dignity and necessity are tested. These outcomes, meticulously recorded in Allied reports, will inform future protocols for POW processing, civilian care, and epidemic prevention across liberated regions of Europe. In this way, a seemingly trivial command, "show your feet," crystallizes into a turning point, a juncture where human vulnerability, medical science, military necessity, and ethical deliberation converge. The scene fades with the women regrouping, medics filing their reports, and officers preparing for the next wave of arrivals. The order, once bizarre and confusing, has revealed its crucial function in the machinery of liberation. From here, we move into the aftermath, the broader consequences of the inspections, the fates of the women, and the enduring lessons of health, authority, and human dignity in the final days of war. In the days following the inspections, the immediate impact on the women and the surrounding operational environment became evident. British medical officers compiled detailed reports noting the prevalence of lice, fungal infections, frostbite, and other foot-related conditions. These reports were sent to higher command, where they informed decisions about quarantine, treatment priorities, and the allocation of scarce medical resources. In many cases, the intervention likely prevented outbreaks of typhus and other lice-borne diseases that had already devastated populations in liberated regions such as Bergen-Belsen. The women themselves began to recover from the most urgent medical issues. Temporary accommodations were provided, clean bedding, disinfected footwear, and access to hot water for washing. Many medics later reflected that the initial shock of having to remove boots and display their feet had created a brief moment of tension, but once procedures were explained and care was administered, compliance was generally met with relief rather than resistance. The juxtaposition of humiliation and practical benefit illustrates the difficult moral terrain navigated by both the captives and the liberators. From an operational standpoint, the inspections reinforced the effectiveness of standardized procedures. British officers recognized that even minor deviations could compromise health protocols. Women who had been quarantined or treated quickly were less likely to spread lice or disease to others, ensuring that the next groups of prisoners or liberated civilians could be processed safely. Logs from this period detail how rapid inspections allowed the British units to maintain momentum in advancing through northern Germany, preventing bottlenecks in the flow of prisoners and resources. Legal and administrative outcomes were also significant. Women who were identified as auxiliaries were processed according to Geneva Convention guidelines for POWs, while civilians with no formal affiliation were directed to humanitarian organizations such as UNRRA for continued care. This classification determined not only access to medical treatment, but also the timeline for release or transfer, affecting personal futures in ways that few could fully understand at the moment. The act of inspecting feet, seemingly trivial, became an essential tool in managing multiple layers of post-liberation complexity: disease control, operational efficiency, legal compliance, and moral responsibility. By the end of the first week, British medics reported measurable improvements in the health and safety of both the women and the broader liberated population. Infection rates in newly established holding areas dropped, and the workflow of prisoner processing was refined for subsequent operations. Simultaneously, the psychological impact on the women persisted. Diaries and later testimonies describe mixed feelings. Initial embarrassment gave way to recognition of the necessity of the procedure, yet memories of exposure and vulnerability lingered. The inspections, while protective in intent, left an imprint on the perception of liberation itself, a reminder that freedom in wartime Europe was frequently accompanied by scrutiny, regulation, and the imposition of unfamiliar authority. The first wave of after-effects set the stage for deeper consequences, both human and institutional. The lessons learned here about hygiene, compliance, and the management of vulnerable populations would echo in protocols across liberated regions for the remainder of the war and into the post-war period. As the days turned into weeks, the broader consequences of the inspections became clearer. Women who had been identified with severe foot injuries or infections received extended care in temporary hospitals set up by British and UNRRA teams. In some cases, amputations or more extensive medical interventions were necessary for those who arrived with untreated gangrene or frostbite, though such extreme cases were rare. Most received antibiotics, antifungal treatments, and proper footwear, which significantly improved their mobility and overall health. These interventions reduced the risk of disease spreading within the holding camps and enabled medical personnel to focus on subsequent groups of prisoners and liberated civilians. Operationally, the inspections served as a model for future procedures. British officers documented every step, from initial identification to quarantine, treatment, and follow-up. These records informed other units entering liberated areas of Germany, ensuring that preventive health measures were consistently applied across regions. The Show Your Feet protocol, initially perceived as odd or humiliating, became codified in post-liberation processing manuals and training sessions for medics and officers. Its effectiveness in preventing outbreaks of lice-borne disease and identifying vulnerable individuals justified the procedure despite its unusual nature. For the women themselves, the aftermath extended beyond physical treatment. Psychologically, the inspections reinforced the dissonance between liberation and personal autonomy. Some women felt relief at being treated for neglected injuries. Others recalled the humiliation of public exposure with lingering discomfort. Historians examining diaries and post-war testimonies note that these experiences contributed to a complex legacy of liberation, one that combined gratitude, fear, and the acute awareness that even acts of care could carry elements of control and surveillance. Legally, the procedure also clarified distinctions between civilians and auxiliaries. Women who were determined to have served in military capacities were registered as POWs, granting them certain protections under the Geneva Convention while also requiring them to remain in custody for extended periods. Civilians, or those deemed non-combatant, were released to humanitarian agencies once medical clearance was obtained. These classifications directly influenced post-war trajectories, from eventual repatriation to reintegration into civilian life, highlighting how a seemingly minor inspection had long-term consequences for individual futures. Institutionally, the lessons extended further. Allied military planners recognized the importance of integrating health, operational control, and legal oversight into a single framework for handling liberated populations. The combined approach, rapid identification, treatment, and classification, reduced the risk of epidemic, maintained order in the camps, and provided a model for handling displaced persons in post-war Europe. The episode also informed post-war public health policy, demonstrating the critical role of preventive measures in large-scale humanitarian operations. By the conclusion of the inspection and its immediate aftermath, what began as a confusing, almost absurd order, "show your feet," had evolved into a microcosm of the challenges of liberation. It revealed the intersection of human vulnerability, medical necessity, operational discipline, and ethical responsibility. The women, the medics, and the officers involved would carry these experiences forward, consciously or unconsciously shaping how they perceived authority, care, and survival in a war-scarred world. The next step in this narrative is reflection, a calm, philosophical consideration of what this moment tells us about the human experience in wartime, the evolution of military medicine, and the delicate balance between dignity and necessity. The story of a simple order, "show your feet," endures as a quiet testament to the strange intersections of war, medicine, and human dignity. At first glance, it seems almost absurd, even trivial. Yet, beneath its surface lies a profound lesson about the practical realities of liberation. Survival often demands measures that challenge comfort, pride, and expectation. In those April days of 1945, German women faced more than just the end of a war. They confronted the immediate tension between vulnerability and compliance, embarrassment and necessity, fear and relief. The Allied medics, soldiers and officers who issued and enforced the command acted not out of cruelty, but out of a carefully honed understanding of risk, that lice, infection, and disease could devastate populations more swiftly than gunfire ever could. The feet exposed in that yard were both a literal and symbolic entry point into the broader machinery of care and control, a reminder that even in liberation, humanity is fragile and survival is painstakingly procedural. This episode illuminates the broader contours of wartime medicine and military ethics. Decisions that may appear minor or humiliating often carry weighty consequences, shaping not only immediate outcomes, but the psychological and social futures of those involved. The inspection protocol demonstrates the delicate balance between operational necessity and human dignity, a balance that militaries, medical teams, and humanitarian organizations continue to navigate to this day. Ultimately, the order to show your feet transcends its moment. It is a reflection on the subtle moral and practical challenges of war, the quiet heroism of compliance under duress, and the unrecognized labor of medics and officers striving to save lives amid chaos. It reminds us that history is often contained in small, easily overlooked acts, commands, inspections, or procedures that reveal the depth of human vulnerability, the rigor of scientific precaution, and the unspoken responsibility of those entrusted with care. In that gravel yard outside Lübeck, amid the smell of disinfectant and the murmurs of the fearful, a lesson quietly unfolded, that even the most unusual orders can carry the weight of life and survival, and that dignity and necessity, however conflicted, can coexist in the harshest of circumstances.